Now we're going to discuss movement and how movement is handled. When it is a unit's turn, they will have the option to move their unit across the battle map. Unit movement allows players to set up defensive and offensive tactical positions. A unit's controlling player chooses when, before or after the unit takes an action, and how their unit moves from their current space on the battle map. All units have a listed movement speed stat on their unit reference card and on their battle map ID piece. This stat indicates how many potential spaces that unit can move on their turn. Alongside their listed movement speed is the movement type, which determines the terrain-based movement costs for each space that unit is going to move into. Depending on the unit's movement type, the cost to enter a terrain space may be higher or lower than other units with differing movement types. There are three base movement types. First is land, then there's mount, and then there's aquatic. For example, Tangus has 4 movement. So their controlling player can move Tangus up to 4 spaces. However, that movement may be hindered or improved based on the terrain that exists within the board. Now, if a space has a movement cost listed, for example, the snowland terrain or the mountain terrain, then those icons indicate how much of the movement speed is going to be used up when moving into that particular space. So in this case, if Tangus were to move into the snowland terrain and then the mountain, although Tangus can move 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, because it costs 2 land movement to move into the snowland and another 2 land movement to move onto a mountain, that's the furthest that Tangus can move without there being a road nearby. Now, the way roads work, taking a free road movement is a during turn ability. And a unit can take a free road movement, for example, Tangus moving onto this mountain which has a road, is handled separately from the unit's movement and can be performed both before a movement, during a movement, or after a movement, and does not count as that unit's movement. You'll notice that any terrain that is not plains will be a road if it doesn't list any movement costs. So in this case, this mountain terrain does not list any movement costs, so it is a road. In addition, this swamp here does not list any movement cost. It is also a road. The settlement terrain, as you notice, doesn't have any movement costs listed on it. It also counts as a road. You'll also notice on the artwork itself whether the terrain will have roads or not. So let's go over some complex movements with Tangus the Unchained and the default land movement. Tangus can move up to 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, if it is along terrain that only has a 1 movement cost. In this case, he moved all along plains terrain. If Tangus wanted to move towards this location over here, Tangus can move through his ally units, 1, and then because there is a swamp here, it would cost 2. And if Tangus wanted to move to any of these 2 spaces here, he would not be able to because the movement cost is 2 and Tangus only has 1 movement left over. But there is a road right here. So Tangus can take a free road movement onto that swamp terrain. So Tangus has only effectively spent 1 movement over here and then taking a free road movement onto here. Tangus still has 3 movement left over. Now, although these 2 spaces are both roads, Tangus has already used up his free road movement for his turn. Free road movement cannot be repeated multiple times during the same turn. So Tangus will use up the remainder of his movement, 2, 3, 4, and Tangus was able to reach this space by utilizing the free road movement along with his default 4 movement spaces. Now, unit movement can be blocked by enemy units. So for example, if the player wanted to move Tangus to here or here, although Tangus can move the 4 spaces, 1, 2, Tangus cannot move through enemy units. By default, all enemy units are going to block the movement of other enemy units. So Tangus will not be able to take a movement onto either of these 2 spaces, and moving around, so 1, 2, this is a road, free, 3, 4, Tangus would not be able to reach either of these 2 spaces. So be wary of enemy unit positioning because you can block the movement of one another based on the positioning of where your units are currently occupying. There is something to know about blocking units from moving through occupied spaces. Small units, that is, units with the small attribute, do not block enemies from moving through their space. In addition, enemies do not block small units from moving through their space. So, for example, we have the Children of the Night, which is a small attribute unit. And you'll notice that all small units will have a blue arrow on their movement type. This is to remind all players that they do not block movement and their movement cannot be blocked by enemies. So if it was the Children of the Night's turn, because they are a small unit, they could move through the enemy, Tangus the Unchained, and get behind enemy lines because they are small and not blocked by enemy units. Likewise, Tangus the Unchained could move through the Children of the Night space in order to get past them deeper into enemy lines, because the Children of the Night are not going to be able to block enemies from moving through their space because they are a small unit. Once again, be sure to reference the blue arrow that's over the movement type as a reminder of this rule. For mount movement, and that is the movement type with the horseshoe icon, for example, we have the Pietic Knights. They can move 5 spaces. And just with all other movement types, you just have to look on each particular space on where you want to move them and whether there is a listed cost. If there is no listed cost, in this case, a horseshoe icon on any space that they move into, then the assumed cost is always going to be 1. So, for example, the Pietic Knights could move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. However, they would not be able to move through Tangus, as Tangus would be blocking their movement. The Pietic Knights, being a mount unit, would have to reference the mount icon on terrain that they would move onto. So if the Pietic Knights wanted to move onto this mountain, it would cost them 1, 2, 3, because moving onto a snowland costs 2 movement, and the remaining movement would be 2 for the Pietic Knights. Unfortunately, the movement cost for mount units to go onto mountain terrain is 3, so they wouldn't be able to move any further onto those mountains. They would have to wait for their next turn to continue their movement onto those mountains. For aquatic units, that is, units with the sea turtle movement type, and for example here we have the amphibious crocodile, which has a movement of 4. Now, by default, you'll notice on the corners of the battle map, there is a movement cost listed for the default plains terrain. In order to move an aquatic unit along plains terrain, it has a movement cost of 2 per space. So, if this amphibious crocodile wanted to move to here, for example, although they can move 4 spaces, because they're trying to move along plains terrain, it would cost 2 per space they move onto. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the furthest they can move, even though they can move up to 4 spaces. So they cannot reach this space here because they're being slowed down by the aquatic movement type. If, however, the aquatic unit wanted to move onto this space, for example, their movement type allows them ease of movement when moving through swamp or river terrain. As you'll notice, both rivers and swamps do not list an aquatic movement type. That is because it only costs 1. And as a reminder, if it doesn't list an icon, the movement cost is only going to be 1. So in this case, they move 4 spaces, 1, 2, and we have a road here, free, And then moving on to this plains terrain costs 2, so 3, 4. So they can effectively reach this space by moving through the swamp terrain and leveraging some free road movement. Now, they could have moved differently. For example, they could have moved 1 onto this road. And as a reminder, the central square of a settlement is a road. So moving onto there could be a free road movement. And then the remainder of their movement, 2, 3, 4. So there's going to be different ways on how you can move around on the battle map, depending on your unit's movement type. Now let's discuss flying enhanced movement. For every space on the battle map, there is the ground space, and then there is the sky that is directly above it. So you can essentially think of 2 spaces or 2 floors of a house. The ground floor and the upper sky floor. A unit with the flying attribute gains the option to move into, move through, and occupy sky terrain. A flying unit's movement type icon will be enhanced with wings to indicate this improved movement. Being capable of moving into sky terrain is very important, as it allows 2 units to occupy the same vertical space on the battle map. Units on the ground cannot be blocked by the movement of units in the sky, while units in the sky do not block the movement of units on the ground. Flying enhanced movement allows a means of bypassing enemy ground units or movement impairing ground terrain by allowing the flying unit to move into and through the sky terrain that floats directly above all ground spaces. An important aspect of units that are occupying sky terrain is that they are out of reach from grounded melee units. This also means that melee attacks from units in the sky cannot reach grounded units. At any point during movement, a flying unit can also choose to land and occupy ground terrain. When landed, a flying unit no longer occupies the sky terrain directly above it. So let's see an example of how flying movement is handled. We have the Monastery Gargoyles here. The Monastery Gargoyles has flying enhanced movement, and it is the default boot or land movement that will have wings on its icon. Now, in order to move into the sky terrain, and sky terrain is represented by these pedestals here, it would cost 2 of the available 5 movement to first move into the sky terrain, that is vertically upwards. So the Monastery Gargoyles spent 2 of their movement to move into the sky terrain, and then they can continue their movement 3, 4, 5, like so. The Monastery Gargoyles can end their turn while occupying sky terrain. And so long as they occupy sky terrain, no melee unit within the vicinity that is occupying the ground is capable of attacking the Monastery Gargoyles that is now occupying the sky terrain. The Monastery Gargoyles also have a melee attack, so they will only be able to melee attack other units that are occupying the sky, unless they choose to land. In order to land the Monastery Gargoyles, it just costs 1 movement to land back onto the ground terrain. And this is a vertical drop onto the space below. Just a reminder, while you're in sky terrain, it only costs 1 movement per space to move onto. Another thing to note is that a unit in the sky can occupy the same vertical space as another unit on the ground. This is the only instance where you can have 2 units on the same space on a battle map. 1 on the ground, in this case Anna, and 1 in the sky, the flying Monastery Gargoyles. If the Gargoyles wanted to land, they would not be able to land onto Anna's space. They would have to first move 1 space over and then land as part of their movement. And now they are back on the ground. Something to know about sky terrain is that sky terrain is a different terrain type and does not benefit from any of the ground terrain type of effects. In fact, units that occupy the sky terrain do suffer from a penalty in that any ranged attacks being made against a unit that occupies sky terrain gets +1 attack. So while occupying sky terrain, although you are safe from melee attacks from the ground, ranged attacks, both from the ground or the sky, will get enhanced against units that occupy sky terrain. So you're a little bit vulnerable against range attacks while occupying sky terrain. Just like with regular movement, units that occupy the sky can block one another. So if you had two units, like the Valkyrie over here, which is also capable of flying, the Monastery Gargoyles would have to move around the Valkyrie in order to get to the space across from them. And just like with units that do not have the flying capability, you can have a flying unit that is also small. You'll notice that the movement type icon, once again, will have both the blue arrow and the wings enhanced icon. For example, this unit here, were a small flying unit, they would be able to move through the enemy because they are not blocked by enemy units by being small. One last thing to cover about flying units and sky terrain. A flying unit can take a free road movement if it is attempting to land onto a space that has a road. So, for the Monastery Gargoyles, they could spend a free road movement to land from the sky onto the ground that has a road, and then continue their 5 movement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That costs 2. This concludes movement for all units and all movement types and enhancements.